March 1945. A railroad bridge over a river near Koblenz, Germany. Cold rain slickens the dark steel girders, and 33 tons of American armor sit idling at the western approach. The retreating enemy has blown up every single road bridge in the sector, leaving only this single line of iron tracks stretching over a 60-foot drop. The metal tracks are narrow, and the spaces between the wooden railroad ties are wide enough to swallow a tank track whole. One wrong move will send a vehicle plunging into the currents below. A single American combat engineer stands at the edge of the chasm, holding a blueprint, and refuses to let the armored column turn back. He claims he can transform this train line into a highway for heavy tanks within hours. General George S. Patton will soon discover how far one man can stretch the limits of engineering when the alternative is total failure. This is the story of how an American combat engineer converted a heavily damaged railroad bridge into a functional tactical crossing under extreme pressure. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe to the channel. We tell the compelling World War II stories that show what happened when the only choice is between bad and worse. Captain William Chen was 29 years old, a combat engineer from San Francisco, California, serving with the 1135th Engineer Combat Group. Before the war, he worked as a structural draftsman, measuring concrete and steel for the growing Pacific Coast infrastructure. He enlisted the morning after Pearl Harbor, leaving behind a young wife and a promising career. On the long march across Western Europe, he lost his younger brother to an enemy artillery barrage outside Metz, a blow that left him quiet, sharp, and intensely focused on his work. He carried a small brass plumb bob in his pocket, a reminder of his trade and his home. His men knew him as an officer who calculated weights and tolerances in his head while mortars fell nearby. Now, he stood at the edge of a rain-slicked gorge, staring at a network of skeletal steel girders, knowing that the fate of an entire armored advance depended entirely on his calculations. Captain Ernst Vogt was 42 years old, an engineer officer from Stuttgart, serving with the retreating German rearguard. He was a product of the old imperial academies, proud, meticulous, and deeply committed to the belief that military science belonged only to aristocratic specialists. His uniform was tailored, his boots were immaculately polished, despite the mud of the retreat, and an iron cross hung precisely from his collar. Vogt believed that the American army was nothing more than an uncultured mass of mechanics, incapable of true tactical improvisation. Before his unit retreated, he personally verified the destruction of the nearby masonry bridges and left the railroad span intact, confident that no sane commander would ever risk heavy vehicles on its open, dangerous skeleton. He watched the approaching American column from a hidden observation post across the river, convinced that the laws of physics and the design of the tracks would halt the advance for days. By March of 1945, the Allied advance into the German homeland had reached a frantic, desperate pace. The Third Army was racing toward the Rhine, pushing through crumbling defenses. But the geography of the region had become the greatest enemy. The terrain was sliced by deep river valleys, and the retreating forces were destroying everything behind them. It was a scorched-earth strategy designed to buy time for the regime. Every stone arch, every concrete highway span, and every wooden footbridge was systematically wired with explosives and detonated. The goal was to force the American armor into a standstill, turning a rapid pursuit into a series of slow, costly engineering operations. Standard military doctrine called for units to halt at these water obstacles, wait for the heavy supply trains to bring up pontoon sections, and construct temporary floating crossings. This process routinely consumed several days, allowing the enemy to slip away and reform their lines on the next ridge. Most division commanders accepted these delays as an unavoidable reality of modern warfare, choosing to protect their equipment rather than risk unauthorized improvisations. They routinely ordered their columns to park along the roadsides, setting up defensive perimeters, while the specialized bridging units labored in the rear. But stagnation was something the leadership of the Third Army refused to tolerate under any circumstances. Every hour spent idling on a riverbank was an hour given to the enemy to dig new trenches and lay more minefields. The orders from the top were clear, relentless, and absolute, demanding that the armored tip of the spear keep moving forward regardless of the obstacles left in the path. It was within this environment of extreme operational urgency that a column of American tanks found themselves staring at the open, cavernous gaps of the Koblenz rail crossing. The vanguard of the armored column sat idling on the muddy approach road, diesel exhaust mixing with the cold rain. Captain Chen walked up to the lead half-track where the forward battalion commander was studying a map under a canvas tarp. The commander looked out over the open ties of the railroad structure and shook his head, stating that the crossing was completely impossible for armored vehicles. Chen stepped forward and said that his engineering team could lay down a solid timber-driving surface over the metal rails within 8 hours. The battalion commander looked at him with disbelief and asked if the captain understood that a Sherman tank weighed over 30 tons and possessed a wheelbase wider than a standard railway car. Chen replied that he had already calculated the axle weight and verified that the underlying steel girders could support the load. The problem was not the weight, but the surface itself, which currently resembled a giant ladder that would swallow the tracks of any vehicle attempting to cross. The commander insisted that the risk was too great, and that they would have to wait for the heavy pontoon trains to arrive from the rear. Chen answered that the pontoon units were stuck in traffic jams 40 miles back and would take at least 4 days to reach this riverbank. He explained that his men could salvage heavy timber beams from the bombed buildings in the nearby town to bridge the gaps between the railroad ties. The commander shifted his boots in the mud and asked what would happen if the timber shifted or split under the immense pressure of a moving tank column. Chen stated that his engineers would bolt each heavy plank directly into the ties, creating a continuous roadway that would hold. He argued that waiting 4 days would allow the enemy to fortify the opposite ridge and slaughter the division when they finally crossed. The commander stared at the rushing water below and muttered that he would not risk court-martial for destroying an entire battalion of tanks on an unauthorized bridge experiment. Chen stood his ground and said that he would take full personal responsibility for the construction and the initial test run. He insisted that he could not afford to lose 24 hours, let alone 4 days of forward momentum. The commander refused to sign the authorization order, declaring that standard Army regulations forbade the use of unrated civilian rail structures for armored operations. He then ordered his radio operator to contact headquarters to report the complete blockage of the advance. The urgent tactical report reached Patton within the hour. Patton arrived within the hour. His open-topped Jeep splattered mud as it pulled up directly to the bridge approach, the twin ivory-handled revolvers visible on his belt, and 4 silver stars gleaming on his helmet. Every man in the vicinity immediately stood at rigid attention. The air grew perfectly silent except for the idling diesel engines and the rush of the river below. The general climbed down from the vehicle, his face carved from cold stone, and walked straight toward the bridge engineers without saying a word. Patton stopped and looked at the German officer who had been brought forward under guard. He asked the prisoner if he was the engineer responsible for this sector. Vogt stood straight, looked at the stars on the helmet, and said he was. Patton asked if the German forces had purposefully left this single railroad crossing intact, while destroying every road bridge for 10 miles. Vogt replied that they had left it because it was utterly useless to an army reliant on heavy motorized armor. He stated that German military science proved a 33-ton tank could not traverse open rail ties without throwing its tracks and destroying its suspension. Patton looked out over the deep chasm and asked if the German High Command truly believed an American engineer was incapable of solving a simple problem of surface friction. Vogt smiled slightly, adjusted his clean cap, and answered that no amateur civilian mechanic could rewrite the structural laws of railroad design in the middle of a combat zone. Patton studied the prisoner for a brief, freezing moment. He said that the German army consistently made the mistake of confusing rigid textbooks with actual military necessity. He pointed a leather-gloved finger at the distant western horizon and stated that 3 miles away, a full column of American armor was currently stalled because of a single river obstacle. He noted that the men who drove those tanks had crossed an ocean to fight, and they did not intend to spend the week sitting in the mud waiting for permission from a defeated enemy garrison. Patton turned his gaze directly to Captain Chen and praised his initiative. He stated that an engineer from San Francisco had shown more tactical imagination than the entire German general staff by recognizing that a railroad could be converted into a highway using nothing but salvaged timber and basic spikes. He looked back at Vogt and declared that the Prussian belief in unbreakable obstacles was about to be dismantled in full view of both armies. He gave the German engineer a final, absolute choice. He could either pick up a heavy wooden beam and help lay the new roadway himself, or he could stand at the center of the span as the very first 33-ton Sherman tank tested the strength of the unbolted planks. Vogt looked at the dark, rushing water 60 feet below, saw the cold certainty in the general's eyes, and silently reached down to grab the wet end of a heavy timber plank. The construction began immediately under the steady, freezing downpour. Captain Chen distributed the heavy tools, and the American combat engineers fell into a rhythmic, grueling pace alongside the captive German officer. Vogt labored at the front of the line, his tailored uniform quickly soaking through with muddy water, his soft hands blistering as he lifted the rough, wet wooden beams retrieved from the nearby town. The engineers laid the thick timber planks flat across the open railroad ties, drilling holes into the wood and securing them to the iron framework with heavy metal bolts. For 8 hours, the sound of rhythmic hammering and shearing metal echoed across the deep river gorge, while the stalled tank crews watched anxiously from the riverbank. When the final plank was secured, the makeshift wooden roadway stretched 200 yards across the skeletal structure, looking uneven and entirely fragile. A lightweight jeep made the initial trial run, its tires bouncing lightly over the wood. Next, a heavy 2.5-ton supply truck crossed successfully, followed by a clanking half-track that caused the underlying steel girders to groan under the shifting weight. Finally, a 33-ton Sherman tank crawled onto the wood at a walking speed of 3 miles per hour. The improvised driving surface flexed visibly over the 60-foot drop, and 2 iron bolts sheared off with loud cracks. But the timber road held firm. Captain Chen stayed with the 1135th Engineer Combat Group until the conclusion of hostilities in Europe, receiving the Bronze Star for his actions at the Koblenz crossing. He returned home to San Francisco, California, in the winter of 1945 and resumed his career as a structural engineer, eventually helping to design the major concrete highway systems that defined the post-war American West. He rarely spoke to his children about the war, but he kept the small brass plumb bob on his office desk until his death in 1982. Captain Vogt spent 3 years in an Allied prison camp before being released during the Reconstruction period. He returned to a ruined Stuttgart, where he found employment as a clerk for the municipal railway system, living a quiet and deeply resentful life. He remained bitter about the humiliation at the river, frequently telling his few acquaintances that the Americans had violated the honorable rules of engineering science. He died in obscurity in 1964. General Patton noted the crossing in his operational diary that very night, writing a single line about the resourcefulness of his combat engineers. He later sent an official commendation to the unit, remarking that a San Francisco draftsman had successfully turned a railroad into a highway using nothing but salvaged timber from bombed structures. He always maintained that an army could bypass any physical obstacle if its leaders possessed sufficient imagination. Some historians have argued that Patton's aggressive utilization of unrated civilian infrastructure was reckless and risked the catastrophic loss of invaluable armored assets during a critical phase of the campaign. They contend that standard operational doctrine existed precisely to prevent such dangerous engineering improvisations over deep river chasms. Others have argued the exact opposite, maintaining that the relentless pressure applied by the leadership of the Third Army was the primary catalyst that broke the German defensive strategy and shortened the conflict. What is certain is that the Koblenz Railroad Bridge held under the immense weight of the crossing column. The innovative timber roadway allowed an entire armored division to maintain its rapid forward momentum and cross the water barrier days ahead of schedule. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have risked the armored column on an improvised timber surface, or would you have waited 4 days for the safe arrival of the heavy pontoon trains? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about what happened when the only choice is between bad and worse, make sure to subscribe.